Imagine sailing across the open Atlantic when you spot a ship drifting silently in the distance. No distress signal, no signs of damage, just empty sails catching the wind. As you draw closer, you notice something strange. The ship isn't abandoned by time. It hasn't been wrecked by a storm. It isn't sinking. In fact, it looks perfectly fine. When you climb aboard, you find food still laid out, personal belongings neatly arranged, the cargo untouched, the captain's instruments still in place, even a child's belongings left behind. But there's one thing missing. Every single person, the captain, his wife, their young daughter, and the entire crew, gone. No signs of violence, no bodies, no struggle. Just a ship drifting through the ocean, as if its crew stood up, walked away, and vanished. Whatever happened on this ship was so urgent that everyone left together, yet so calm that nothing was destroyed. And that's what makes this story terrifying, because the ocean didn't take them, and the ship didn't fail them. This vessel was called the Mary Celeste, and more than a century later, no one can explain why everyone on board disappeared. This is the true story of the Mary Celeste, a real ship, a real crew, and one of the most unsettling maritime mysteries ever recorded. What makes this case different isn't just that the ship was found empty, it's how it was found. The Mary Celeste wasn't damaged, it wasn't looted, it wasn't sinking. Everything needed to survive at sea was still on board, except the people. Over the years, investigators, historians, and sailors have proposed explanation after explanation. Some sound logical, others sound impossible, and every single one leaves behind a detail that doesn't quite fit. In this video, we're going to walk through what was discovered on the ship, what didn't happen, and the theories that try and fail to explain why an experienced captain would abandon a perfectly functional vessel in the middle of the Atlantic. And by the end, I want you to decide something for yourself, not which theory sounds the most dramatic, but which one actually explains the evidence. Because once you know the full story, the most frightening possibility isn't that something attacked the crew, it's that they may have left the ship by choice. To understand what happened on the Mary Celeste, we have to go back to a time when crossing the Atlantic was routine, but never safe. The year was 1872. The Mary Celeste was not an aging vessel with a troubled past. It was seaworthy, well-maintained, and recently inspected. More importantly, it was commanded by a man who knew the sea. Captain Benjamin Briggs was an experienced sailor. He was cautious, methodical, not the kind of man who took unnecessary risks. This voyage wasn't just another job. On board with him were his wife, Sarah, and their young daughter, Sophia. He had sailed dangerous routes before, but this time he brought his family. That decision matters, because it tells us something important. Captain Briggs did not expect trouble. Alongside them was a small crew, men who had sailed before, men who understood the risks of the open ocean. Together, they prepared for a routine journey across the Atlantic. The cargo was industrial alcohol, properly stored, sealed below deck. The destination was clear. The weather forecasts were acceptable. Nothing about this voyage suggested danger. No warnings, no signs, no reason to believe this ship would become a mystery. And yet, it would be the last time any of them were ever seen alive. Because somewhere between departure and destination, something happened aboard the Mary Celeste. Something that convinced every person on that ship to leave it behind. Together, in the middle of the ocean. Several weeks after the Mary Celeste set sail, another vessel was making its way across the Atlantic. It was the Dei Gratia. On the horizon, the crew noticed a ship drifting alone. At first, There was nothing alarming about it. Ships drifted all the time. Weather, delays, miscalculations. But as they drew closer, something felt wrong. The ship's movements were unsteady. Its sails were partially raised. It wasn't responding to signals. When the captain of the Dei Gratia ordered his crew to approach, they still had no reason to expect what they were about to find. Boarding a silent ship was dangerous, but also an opportunity. Salvage rights were valuable, so a small group climbed aboard. The first thing they noticed was how normal everything looked. The deck was intact, the rigging undamaged. There were no signs of a storm. Then they went below deck. The ship's cargo was still in place. Supplies were untouched. Personal belongings lay where they had been left. Nothing had been packed. Nothing had been stolen. There was food on board, clean water, enough provisions to survive for months. The captain's log was still there, the navigation instruments still in place. And then they realized something else. The lifeboat was missing, not damaged, not destroyed, gone. Which meant the crew didn't disappear one by one. They left together, deliberately, and they took only one boat. As the boarding crew searched the ship from bow to stern, one fact became impossible to ignore. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no broken equipment, no indication of a struggle. The Mary Celeste hadn't been abandoned in panic. It had been left behind, a perfectly functional ship, drifting silently across the Atlantic, waiting to be found. To understand why this case refuses to be solved, we need to look closely at what was found on the Mary Celeste, and just as importantly, what wasn't. Below deck, the cargo was still secured. Over 1,000 barrels of industrial alcohol sat in place, undisturbed, unlooted. There were no signs of theft, which immediately ruled out piracy. The crew's personal belongings were still on board: clothing, tools, valuables, even items no sailor would willingly abandon at sea if the crew expected to return. This makes sense. If they didn't, it makes no sense at all. The captain's quarters told a similar story. His charts were still laid out. His logbook was intact. The last entry showed nothing unusual. No panic, no warnings, no mention of danger, just routine navigation. And then, nothing. The navigation instruments were still there. The sextant, the compass, tools no experienced captain would leave behind unless he believed he wouldn't need them. Then there was the condition of the ship itself. The hull was intact. The sails were damaged, but usable. There was no evidence of a violent storm. Some water had entered the ship's hold, but not enough to threaten its stability, not enough to justify abandoning it. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, the lifeboat was missing. Only one, which meant everyone left together. There was no division, no fight, no hesitation. Whatever decision was made, it was made as a group. A captain, his wife, their child, and an experienced crew all agreeing to the same unthinkable choice: to leave a functioning ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and never return. When the Mary Celeste was found, the first explanations came quickly. Too quickly. Pirates, mutiny, a violent storm. But when investigators looked closer, each one fell apart. Piracy was ruled out almost immediately. There was nothing missing. The cargo was intact, valuables untouched, no signs of forced entry or violence. Pirates don't abandon profit, and they don't leave witnesses without leaving evidence. Mutiny made even less sense. The crew had no history of conflict, no reason to overpower the captain, and even if they had, why leave the ship? A successful mutiny ends with control of the vessel, not abandonment. Then there was the weather. At the time the Mary Celeste was sailing, no major storms were reported in the area. The ship showed no signs of having survived one. No broken masts. No severe hull damage. The sea hadn't forced them off the ship. Mechanical failure was also unlikely. The Mary Celeste was seaworthy, capable of continuing the voyage. Any problem severe enough to justify evacuation would have left visible damage. It didn't. What this means is unsettling. The crew didn't leave because the ship was destroyed. They didn't leave because they were attacked. They didn't leave because they had no choice. They left because they believed staying was more dangerous than the open ocean, and that belief is the heart of the mystery. Over the years, many explanations have been offered for what happened aboard the Mary Celeste. Some are grounded in logic, others rely on fear, and a few blur the line between the two. The first theory is also the most widely accepted, that the crew believed the ship was about to explode. The Mary Celeste was carrying industrial alcohol, highly flammable. Investigators later discovered that several barrels had leaked. Alcohol vapors are invisible, odorless at sea. It's possible the crew heard a loud noise below deck, a pressure release, or a sudden rupture. To an experienced sailor, that could have sounded like the beginning of an explosion. According to this theory, the captain made a calculated decision. Evacuate temporarily. Attach a rope to the lifeboat. Stay close to the ship until the danger passed. It explains why they took the lifeboat. It explains why they didn't take supplies. It even explains the calm condition of the ship. But there's a problem. There was no rope attached, no evidence they stayed nearby, and no reason they wouldn't return once the ship failed to explode. Which brings us to the next possibility. Some believe the crew was thrown off course by a navigational error, faulty instruments, misjudged position. If Captain Briggs believed the ship was drifting toward land, rocks, reefs, shallow waters, abandoning it might have seemed like the safer choice, especially with a child on board. But this theory also fails. The instruments were functional, the charts were accurate, and an experienced captain doesn't abandon a ship based on uncertainty alone. Then there's the theory few like to consider, that something aboard the Mary Celeste caused the crew to panic without leaving physical evidence. Not a storm, not an attack, but a perception of danger strong enough to override logic. Because whatever they believed was happening, it convinced every person on that ship to make the same fatal decision. There is one theory that investigators rarely like to dwell on, not because it's supernatural, but because it suggests something far more disturbing, that nothing was actually wrong with the ship, that the danger the crew believed they were facing may not have existed at all. Human perception at sea is fragile. Isolation, stress, exhaustion. Add the presence of alcohol fumes, invisible, disorienting, capable of causing dizziness and confusion. Now, imagine hearing a sudden sound below deck, a bang, a vibration. Nothing explodes, but the fear remains. In that moment, the captain has seconds to decide. Stay on the ship with his family, or risk the lifeboat. If his judgment was impaired even slightly, the decision may have felt obvious. Leave now, return later. Except something went wrong. The rope was never secured. The distance grew. The current carried the ship away, and suddenly the lifeboat was alone. No supplies, no navigation tools, no chance of recovery. The Mary Celeste didn't abandon its crew. The crew abandoned the Mary Celeste, and the ocean did the rest. If this theory is true, then the mystery isn't about monsters or attacks. It's about how quickly certainty can collapse. when fear enters the equation. Even after all the theories, the Mary Celeste refuses to make sense. Why abandon a ship that was still seaworthy? Why leave behind navigation tools no experienced captain would ever give up? Why take the lifeboat, but no supplies? Why was there no distress signal? And perhaps the most troubling question of all, why has no trace of the crew ever been found? No bodies washed ashore, no wreckage discovered. No final message, just a ship found drifting, intact, silent, and waiting. If fear drove the crew to leave, what exactly were they afraid of? And if the decision was a mistake, at what moment did they realize it was too late? Somewhere between the ship and the lifeboat, the answer disappeared, and it took everyone with it. So now, the mystery belongs to you. Which theory makes the most sense? And which detail doesn't sit right? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because more than a century later, the Mary Celeste still hasn't given up its secret, and maybe it never will. The Mary Celeste wasn't found destroyed. It wasn't sinking. It wasn't under attack. It was found waiting. Waiting with its sails still catching the wind. Waiting with food still on board. Waiting with a child's belongings, left exactly where they had been placed. Nothing on the ship suggested an ending, only an interruption. As if the crew believed they would return, as if they stepped away for a moment and never came back. The ocean didn't claim the Mary Celeste. Time didn't erase it. It was left behind, carrying unanswered questions instead of people. And that's what makes this story linger. Because some mysteries don't announce themselves with chaos. Some simply wait. Now I want to hear from you. After everything we know, which explanation makes the most sense? Was it a calculated decision that went wrong? A moment of fear that spiraled out of control? Or something we still don't understand? And, more importantly, which detail bothers you the most? The missing lifeboat, the untouched cargo, or the fact that an experienced captain left everything behind, with his family on board? Share your theory in the comments, because every explanation explains something, but none of them explain everything. The Mary Celeste didn't vanish. It survived, and that may be the most unsettling part. A ship that outlived its crew, a voyage that never reached an ending. More than a century later, the Mary Celeste still drifts through history, not as a solved case, but as a reminder that sometimes the most frightening mysteries aren't the ones that end in disaster, but the ones that end in silence.